Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for today's Migration Dialogues webinar that focuses on a very timely topic, the challenges of return and reintegration amidst COVID-19. With thousands of overseas Filipinos who are returning to the country as a result of this global health crisis, the issue of return and reintegration it becomes even more important today. My name is Celago. I'm the convener of the Philippine Migration Research Network and a member of the faculty of De La Salle University, and I will be the moderator for this afternoon's webinar. This webinar is the fourth of a series of webinars that the Philippine Migration Research Network and the Philippine Social Science Council are mounting in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one delved into the impact of the pandemic on Filipino migrants and their remittances. The second tackled the situation of overseas Filipinos in the UK. And the third was about the situation of Filipino seafarers. This fourth webinar shall focus on the current situation of Filipino migrants as they return and reintegrate in the light of the global pandemic. The title of the webinar asks actually a double-edged question. Babalik ka rin? The question, babalik ka rin, actually is put forth to our OFWs, asking them, babalik ka rin ba sa Pilipinas as a result of this global crisis? And if you do, babalik ka rin ba sa abroad? Okay. This session will try to address some of the issues related to this to return and reintegration. This webinar will last approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes. This webinar is brought to you by the Philippine Migration Research Network with the support of the Philippine Social Science Council, or PSSC. PMRN is a network of individuals consisting mostly of social scientists and other professionals that was organized to advance knowledge and understanding of national and international migration trends and developments. Meanwhile, PSSC is a nonprofit organization of professional social science associations and social science research and instructional institutions in the Philippines. It acts as the secretariat of the PMRN. This afternoon, we are privileged to have as our resource persons individuals that are in the best position to talk about the issues and challenges of return and reintegration. Let me now introduce you to our panel of resource persons. Our first speaker is Undersecretary Sarah Lu Ariola. She is the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Yusek Sarah. She served as the Chief of Staff of the Office of the Majority Leader at the Senate of the Philippines and earned her AB in Communication and Juris Doctor degree from the Ateneo de Manila University and her Master of Laws in International Human Rights Law from the University of Essex. She is inscribed in the roster of the Gawad Mabini with the rank of Dakilang Kamanong. Our second speaker is Mr. Roel Martin, who is the OIC Director of the National Reintegration Center for OFWs, or NRCO. NRCO is tasked to oversee the development of programs and services towards productive reintegration of our modern-day heroes, the overseas Filipino workers. He is one of the pioneer personnel who assumed office in NRCO in 2013. The center is an attached office of the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration for policy and program coordination. He is a graduate of political science from the University of Santo Tomas and has been in public service for 2 decades now. Our third speaker is Mr. Rex Varona. He is currently the National Project Coordinator of the Safe and Fair Program on Realizing Women Migrants Workers' Rights and Opportunities in the ASEAN region of the International Labor Organization's country office here in the Philippines. He graduated with a degree in Community Development from the University of the Philippines in Diliman and has worked for 20 years in Hong Kong, first as a migrant worker himself and later on as Executive Director of the Asian Migrant Center, a migrant research and advocacy NGO. He was a member of the Executive Committee of the Migrant Forum in Asia, the biggest network of migrant organizations and civil society groups in in Asia. When he returned to the Philippines in 2017, he continued his advocacy on reintegration strategies for OFWs, especially women migrants and domestic workers. Our last but certainly not the least speaker is Ms. Thetis Abrera Mangajas, who is a social scientist with extensive hands-on experience on migration policy and its planning in both national and international work environments. Recently retired from the ILO as the Deputy Regional Director responsible for Asia and the Pacific, she has served as Deputy Director and Deputy Administrator of the Overseas Employment Development Board and the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, and as Chief Technical Advisor of large technical cooperation projects on migration and human trafficking based in the ILO headquarters in Geneva and in the regional office in Bangkok. Okay. So we would like, as we begin our webinar, we would like to remind our viewers that we have a Q&A session before ending the webinar. So we encourage you to write your questions in the comment section of this live video. So without much ado, we would like to begin our discussion, and we would like to ask Undersecretary Sarah to present to us an overview of the OFWs affected by COVID-19. Yusek Sarah, I give you the floor.
Good afternoon, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon, distinguished panelists. Before I proceed, I see Thetis Mangajas in the panel. I don't know if she remembers me, but that's a very young year. I met her when I was still a program coordinator as a in Ateneo Human Rights Center. But anyway, we prepared some slides for the repatriation efforts of the country. I think it's worth noting that, can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Yes. Actually, the IATF designated the Department of Foreign Affairs to be in charge of facilitating the repatriation of our migrant workers. Not only migrant workers, but all overseas Filipinos who are in distress. So aside from our OFWs, we also bring home our J1 visa holders, our tourists, our students, and anyone else who wants to come home, so long as they're Filipino citizens. Actually, the thing with DFA, we have more than 90 posts all over the world, and more in many territories, and there are some places that there's no OWA and POLO. The DFA takes over the functions of other government agencies. As of now, we have 44,169 overseas Filipinos repatriated. That's as of June 16, 2020. 25,941 are sea-based and 18,678 are land-based. To explain, there are more sea-based workers because that were repatriated, because it has been easier for government to repatriate them, particularly because it's the manning agencies who takes care of chartering the flights and also the hotel expenses. So that's a very big thing. But there are more than 30,000 Filipino sea-based workers who are still stranded in the Americas as to date. The 18,678 land-based come from all over the world, particularly in the Middle East, some from Africa, some from Southeast Asia, and other parts of Asia also. As to the COVID-19 related assistance, we have repatriation assistance. Of course, we've given all our post-standby funds to address the welfare assistance of our overseas Filipinos, particularly in places where there's no OWA or POLO, and provision for emergency supplies for medicine, food, and accommodation, OFs, affected by COVID-19. And of course, the sad part here is the shipment of remains, because we have several OFWs who lost their lives in the process. What's allowed under our policies is you can bring home the body so long as the coffin is hermetically sealed, subject to cremation within hours upon arrival. But many families opt for cremation of remains. But this is quite difficult, especially in Middle East countries. So so what we do is we really have to bring home the body. Next is so far we have facilitated. These are the DFA facilitated repatriations from all over the world, from Cambodia, from Vietnam, Thailand, Maldives, Malaysia, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, Qatar. I mean, it's a lot. But we have our pending chartered flights for the coming 2 weeks will be from Muscat, Oman, Tripoli, Libya, Doha, Qatar, Amman, Jordan, Macau, China, Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Lahore, Pakistan, Cairo, Egypt, and of course, our repatriation flights from the UAE are continuing in Saudi Arabia because we consider these two places as the epicenter of the crisis because there are thousands of OFWs who want to come home. So actually, um, bringing them home is easier, and of course the biggest challenge is what are we going to do once they're back. We expect another around 50,000 to 100,000 OFWs in the next 2 months. And that's a lot. That's a big number that will add on to the numbers of jobless individuals here in the Philippines. And just like any other economy that is in a recession right now, the COVID-19 pandemic is really has given all governments a lot of problems, especially economically. But I think this is something that we have to look at because we have more than 10 million Filipinos abroad. And if at least even 10% of them who are going to return, that the biggest challenge is how they can reintegrate in the Philippine society. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yusek Sarah. So as you can see from the statistics from the DFA, there's really thousands of overseas Filipino workers that have returned and many, many more that are expected to return. So now the issue is, okay, what do you do with all of these OFWs that are returning? And so to throw light on what is being done by government as far as the returning overseas Filipino workers are concerned is I would like to ask Director Roel Martin to talk about the NRCO and OWA's reintegration program for our returning overseas Filipino workers. So Roel, please.
Yes, ma'am. Stella. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all.
Nakamute ka ata. Nakamute ka, Roel.
Let me check.
Okay na. I think you're on. Yes.
Okay. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. And allow me to present to you the existing reintegration programs and services being offered to our overseas Filipino workers. First and foremost, allow me to share to you the framework, the operative framework that we've been following while we offer development of programs and services. The Overseas Workers Welfare Administration likewise offer welfare assistance to our repatriated OFWs. So basically, we need to consider them as, well, of course, if they are planned OFWs who can be termed as planned returnees as well as forced returnees. So there are specific programs and services being offered to them, like in this case of global pandemic. So basically, a lot of OFWs who are returning are considered the forced returnees. So basically, we need to offer them first welfare assistance during crisis or specific interventions. But for developmental programs, like those who have planned to come home,
because we have several OFWs who lost their lives.
so basically, we need to offer them reintegration advocacy as well as preparedness programs, and a lot of programs and services being offered to them is being implemented by our office, the National Reintegration Center for OFWs. So we have strategies like the stepladder, socioeconomic intervention, migration corridor approach, of course, we need to tailor fit their occupation skill sets in other business opportunities here in the Philippines. So
Now, excuse me, Roel, can you just put your slides on slideshow para it fills the screen?
okay.
It's there on the lower right-hand corner, the one with the screen. Yeah, yes. So that the whole shows.
Okay.
Yes, better.
So
Go ahead, please.
So this is the comprehensive overseas Filipinos reintegration program operative framework that we've been discussing. So what are the specific programs that we need to offer to them? So basically we have trainings and seminars. Of course, we have livelihood opportunities to be provided with them. And we do likewise provide employment facilitation and financial literacy. So basically, these are the four essential programs and services being offered to our OFWs. But we need to address their welfare issues and concerns, particularly those affected by COVID-19. So we have right now been implementing, I mean, the facilitating their return here. So upon arrival, they need to be tested, and then OWA provides for their hotels for the as quarantine facilities. So normally they need to be at the quarantine facility for the 14-day mandatory quarantine, but because of the swab testing being conducted upon arrival, it has been reduced to around 4 to 7 days. So after they receive their negative result, so basically we need to provide either transportation, either by land or by sea or by air. So they need to proceed to Terminal 2 of our airport so that we can provide them with airfare assistance going to their provinces. So basically, if they are now in their provinces, we can offer to them livelihood opportunities, including employment facilitation. Just this morning, we were able to discuss with ECOC for a possible collaboration as regards the provision of online learning on entrepreneurship, including soft skills for them, so that we'll be able to provide them the needed intervention should they require upskilling or reskilling. So the TESTA is likewise, TESTA trainings are likewise available to them. We have already a memorandum of understanding with TESDA. And even before this COVID-19, we likewise provide the list of names of our repatriated OFWs to TESDA for them to provide available trainings to our migrant workers. For employment facilitation, so basically we have likewise initiated other stakeholders in return and reintegration, specifically private companies, to help us in providing them with employment opportunities here in the country. Of course, the Build Be Build program under the DPWH and other private companies has been helpful for us in providing some of the jobs to our migrant workers. But we have already negotiated or talked with other private companies like the contact centers in the Philippines, the Citel Group, and of course the Motolite Corporation has been in close contact with us and is now requiring the list of our repatriated OFWs, including other companies as Mega Sardines, the DMCI or the Corporation Construction, a giant construction company, and likewise including other government agencies like the Department of Agriculture, the DOST, the DTI, PTTC, of course, just like I've mentioned, TESDA for skills upgrading or reskilling. So we have livelihood programs, but then again, we just need to provide them upon their return in their provinces. But recently, the OWA Board of Trustees has also approved a cash assistance. They call it OTP or Overseas Tulong sa Pagunlad. For active OWA members, they will be given a cash assistance of 10,000 pesos. Of course, it is worth to mention also that the Department of Labor and Employment has initiated the DOL ACAP, wherein affected migrant workers, Filipino migrant workers, are given $200 or equivalent of it in the amount of 10 pesos to affected overseas Filipino workers. So ito po yung mga binibigay ho natin sa ating mga bumabalik na ating mga OFWs at marami pa hong ibibigay sa kanila na nakalaan at every month po or kung kinakailangan na mag-meet yung OWA Board of Trustees para mag-create or mag-develop ng mga programs and services para sa ating mga migranteng maggagawa, ginagawa naman po ito. Before I forgot, yes, of course, we value the education at we know that a lot of relatives of our OFWs may be affected because of lack of work. So maybe or shall I say, there are plans that we provide educational assistance also to deserving migrant workers kung kinakailangan po ng ayuda para sa pagtulong sa mga tuition na kakailanganin ng kanilang mga anak. With that, maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Director Martin. I have a question though. Can you tell us, give us some idea or numbers in terms of how many of these return OFWs have been given assistance by NRCO or by OWA? And what types of assistance have already been given to these workers?
Okay, yes ma'am. For livelihood, before the COVID-19, we usually average around 20 to 25,000 overseas Filipinos who are given livelihood assistance. But for as regards the COVID-19 pandemic, so basically we have the Hatid Sundo and of course the hotel accommodation and basically those provided with shelters also, crew ship OFWs who needs shelter. So basically, these are OFWs that were provided with welfare assistance. As regards reintegration, well, we still yet to provide them with reintegration assistance because they need to be back to their provinces and let our regional welfare officers provide them with the reintegration programs that are lined up.
Okay. Thank you very much. So to our viewers now, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask your questions and write them in the comment section for any of our panelists to answer. So let's move on to our next discussion, and Mr. Rex Varona to share with us his thoughts and insights on reintegration.
Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. I-share ko lang po yung screen sa dali.
Okay.
Thanks so much for giving me the chance to share with you some insights. And as my colleagues are saying, the COVID pandemic has already impacted quite significantly. Can you see my screen already?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. We can see.
So essentially, Okay, I'll try to cover some of the direct impacts of COVID, and then are there standards to protect migrants in these situations, and then what are the gaps in the reintegration strategy of the Philippines. So I just want to show you that we are now hitting more than 7 million globally in terms of the pandemic. The message to this is it will not be soon enough that many of the OFWs will continue to be affected. In fact, as DFA USEC Sarah has said, more than 5,500 have already been infected among Filipinos. But if we compare the Philippines relative to other countries in the world, we are actually in the upper quartile. We are in the top 20%, 25% of all countries in the world with number of COVID cases. And that's why the impact on the health aspect only is already very significant. Now we are hitting 25,000 already, and more than 1,000 have died. But this counts only the Filipinos in the Philippines. We'd like to highlight, I'm just showing the curve that yes, it is flattening, but it is not decreasing. In fact, the Philippines is showing I'll just get a laser pointer, that recently there's an uptick even in our trend. So we are not like the other ASEAN countries where the flattening is sustained. Now we are in danger actually of still continuing to increase. So I'm saying this because the actual cases of Filipinos actually with COVID is not only 25,000. If we add the 5,000, we actually have about more than 31,000 Filipinos infected, which is more than 20% of all the Filipinos. In terms of deaths, we are hitting 1,500. So we are actually quite in a serious situation. And just to highlight that the impacts of the COVID are gendered. They have disproportionate impacts on the men and women OFWs. And of course, past epidemics have shown that the impacts actually increase the risk and compound the dangers to violence and exploitation of women OFWs. There are standards. I will not explain them too much, but and we will have copies of these slides. The ILO, UN Women, IOM, among the different UN families have already issued guidelines on how countries are supposed to respond. The main message here is gender responsiveness, rights-based approach, and the primary responsibility of the states, now not excluding migrants in the response. A good example is Singapore, when they missed out on the tens of thousands of migrant workers in the dormitories. Then we saw a spike in the cases of Singapore in the past month. So that's why it's very essential. So these are some of the guidelines. I will not discuss them now, that we can use in terms of how to respond to COVID, including in cases of return and reintegration. What are the gaps that we need to address in the Philippines? I want to show that there are stressors and shocks that dictate how the Filipinos return. And a lot of these are not new. In fact, COVID is not the first pandemic that has devastated and pressured many Filipinos to go home. We have the financial crisis in 1997, we have SARS in 2002, we have the global crisis in 2003. So the message being, if we knew that these things are happening, they provide shocks to the return of Filipinos, how prepared are we? Now, Sir Royal was saying preparedness framework, but seems that our responses have not leveled up to these demands. So yeah, the shock now is COVID, and the shock is more intense because it will create the worst global recession, both in the Philippines and abroad. It will create job displacement, more than 25 million, ILO is saying, and PSA has said it already caused the joblessness of more than 5 million Filipinos in the past 2 months only. And of course, the displacement of Filipinos abroad. USEC Sarah has said that more than almost 50,000 have returned now, but this is only the tip of the more than 400,000 that have been displaced. And since we have more than 2.3 million OFWs abroad, it means that potentially more will go home. The gender dimension is more of the women will be pressured to lose their jobs. Why? Because the gender deployment patterns of the Philippines is very women specific. On top is, this is the pattern of percentage of women deployed in certain job categories. The upper one is elementary jobs, domestic work and others. Between 2007, the past 12 years, you will see that 86% are mostly migrant women in the domestic work, in the clerical jobs, in the services sector. So meaning to say these are precarious jobs. Without COVID or with COVID, these are the jobs that tend to be first displaced during pandemics. So we are not prepared to address this, and which shows now in the current pandemic that there are no anticipatory kind of programs that would be able to respond to all of these. And we know that remittances will drastically decline. But the more important message here is Filipinos families have very high dependency on use of remittance. This is the percentage of households of OFWs on where they use the remittances. You will see also the past 12 years. These are BSP data. You will see that OFW families, more than 96% of them are dependent on remittances for food. And only a very low 6% are able to do investments out of the remittances, and very consistent pattern over the past 20 years. So the message being, the drastic decline in remittances will endanger actually the survival of the families. And therefore, if the reintegration is focused more on investments, then very few, 1 in 10 only of the FW should be able to respond, because many of them are not engaged in the entrepreneurship aspect. The sudden return, more than 50,000 now. As Yusek was saying, this will compete with the 5 million that are already unemployed now. So, the big problem is even before COVID, annually, this is the data of repatriated, distress, or traffic Filipinos in the past before COVID. We can see that every year we have more than 13,000 Filipinos already being repatriated. So therefore, COVID is not the only factor that pushed many Filipinos, but even before, the abuses already pushed them in. I'm highlighting this data because more or less many of us know already the profile of the migrant workers, and yet the programs we have on reintegration in the Philippines are very niche-based, very specific sectors that we are helping. And therefore, when the shock comes in, then there's very little capacity to address them. Also, just to flag that many of the OFWs who were deployed in the 1970s are now of retirement age. But only a minority of OFWs actually are covered by social protection. Although these are mandatory, latest data of SSS, less than a quarter of the migrants actually have SSS coverage because they drop out of it. And the Pag-ibig data is quite spurious because it involves inactive members. That's why it's even higher than the population of OFWs overseas. No? But even PhilHealth, less than half are covered. The message being, in shocks like this, it is very dangerous because there is no social protection. Existing programs, Yusek, Sarah, and Director Noel already explained this, so I will not go too much. But the gaps that I want to highlight is, as I was saying, the existing services on reintegration can be easily overwhelmed because of the influx of more than 50,000 and perhaps more than 100,000. Secondly, the emphasis is on entrepreneurship and one-off cash assistance. Again, this will not enable the migrants to survive and sustain a sustainable livelihood. The framework on preparedness, now even before leaving and while abroad and returning, is not yet well ingrained, especially in the practices. NRCO is good, but there are many other agencies, including LGUs, are not yet practicing this. And many of the FWs are returned has really not much capacity to go into entrepreneurship and livelihood schemes. There are small pathways on re-employment, and the families, normally they are so dependent, other members of the family are not working. So therefore, when the FW loses the job or income, the rest of the families also don't have income. And in all of this, the pressure is to go back abroad. So therefore, ways forward. One of the things we want is, this more or less echoes Director Noel's point, that providing distress assistance, pandemic assistance is not reintegration yet. This is just addressing the distress. So what needs, and social protection is important because in all of this, if there is no social protection, no amount of dole out can salvage the family. So like retirement, like provident savings, the migrants have to be able to build their assets so that along the way, when they lose their jobs, they have a fallback. And therefore, the referral systems have to differentiate between those who would find jobs again, reskilling, those who would go into entrepreneurship because not all are entrepreneurs, and then those who would want to reintegrate because they are survivors of trafficking or others, or those who retire, or because of no other option, they have to be redeployed. So I think the reintegration strategy have to be differentiated to address the different aspects of need. Second, that the framework on the reintegration should be based on social protection. I think entrepreneurship should not be the backbone of the reintegration program. Strengthening the social protection, provident savings, retirement should be the strongest investment that the government should do, so that then when the migrant return, even without assistance from government, they have built up their savings. There's actually an advocacy by trade unions and civil society for a creation of the national social protection savings program for Filipino migrants. This essentially suggests to create a sovereign fund to centralize the asset building provident savings of OFW Filipinos at par with SSS and Pag-ibig, and then centralize it so that it's incentivized and matched it with local government like the Tres por Uno model of Mexico. For every peso that a migrant saves in the program, local government or national government matches it, so that it's not a dole out, but it creates the assets for the migrants based on their savings. And then the rest of the recommendation is strengthen really the families and the networks of migrants, a more targeted way where the communities of migrants abroad are linked to their hometowns back in the countries, so that then the assets that they build, reintegration programs, help in the local development. This is, I think, the developmental framework that Director Noel was saying. Many CSOs are doing this, but they need to be scaled up. And finally, when we are now building the COVID recovery plan, it's essential not only to do a new normal, but a better normal. No? Social protection-based participation of the migrants and consultation with the women and other stakeholders in the creation of the response plan, so that we'll be able to survive this all better. So again, I'd like to flag that the ILO has given a framework to do this, the 4 pillars. So we hope we can use this as a guide in doing our recovery plans post-COVID. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ma'am.
Yes, thank you very much, Rex, for that comprehensive framework for actually reintegration. I like that phrase of yours, no, that we should not just, take care of the new normal, but we have to build a better normal, especially as far as our overseas Filipino workers are concerned. One question, maybe I can raise this before I give the floor to Tetis, is a question that has been raised. Because if you have to have a reintegration program, one of the things that you need to do is you have to know who are these people that are returning and need reintegration. And you also need, so there's a question that has been raised. Does OWA, and maybe Director Roel can answer this, does OWA have a database of repatriated OFWs? And the question there is, how will NRCO and OWA know what are the needs of these return, OFWs that have returned? So see, Director Roel, do you have an answer for that?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, we have a database of returning OFWs, but these are limited to those who have availed of reintegration programs. But this is also a challenge and an issue that we would want to address. We've been implementing this or recommending this, that we should have a very comprehensive databasing of returning OFWs, starting from our embassies and labor offices, so that they have to come up with a list of OFWs in their community, so that should they decide to come home, then basically we can catch the related or personal information, so that we'll be able to facilitate whether they would want to go into livelihood, or perhaps employment facilitation, or maybe just investment or training. So right now, due to this pandemic, OWA, in collaboration with the Department of Labor and Employment, has initiated the OASIS, or the Information System Assistance Overseas Overseas Filipinos Assistance Information System, to capture those returning OFWs. So maybe this would likewise complement our existing captured database so that it will be more comprehensive, and at the same time, meron na ho tayo talagang database ng kahit hindi pa sila bumabalik, pero ito yung mga OFWs na sooner or later ay babalik dito sa ating bansa at magagamit po natin for policy and program implementation.
So is Oasis now actually being conducted? Is it working? Is
Yes,
it
ma'am.
now being
It's
implemented?
being implemented by the Department of Labor and Employment through the Philippine Overseas Labor Offices across the globe. So ginagawa na ho ito at kinakapture na. Pero yun nga, kailan lang ho in-implement, ano? So yung existing databasing ho natin ay ito yung mga OWA members, of course, and those who have availed of programs and benefits under OWA and under NRCO. Then we have a list of these OFWs.
So essentially then, there is really no database of returning, like all those that return to the Philippines, because what you're saying is what the database that OWA has would really be those that have actually, that are members of OWA and those who have availed of the services. Because, you know, if you look at the data now, there's thousands of overseas Filipinos that are returning, and it would be good to get a profile of who these Filipinos are, no? Like even in terms of number of males and females, the types of occupations that have been affected in particular by this pandemic now. And because knowing that, then NRCO and OWA can better tailor fit the kinds of reintegration programs and services that you are offering to the workers, because it will be now more needs specific to the workers. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, we will continue with the discussion and some of the questions later on. We can now move on first to Thetis. Yes, Thetis, I give you the floor. Thetis?
I'm just making sure it's unmuted.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to take a slightly different perspective in the presentations, and maybe just I've actually looked at, I've actually named how I'm going to say something like overseas employment at the crossroads. I think historically, since I've been familiar with the overseas employment program from the 70s, I'd like to highlight that this particular pandemic or this particular overseas employment crisis or pandemic crisis is really a major game changer. It is a milestone that we can be looking back many years after in terms of our overseas employment history. I've identified three. The first would be actually the start of the overseas employment program in 1975, when really there was overseas employment prior to that, but the 1974 formalized the program, created the institutions, and in a way provided the imprint of government for a foreign employment program for the country. The second milestone, or the second game changer, was actually Flor Contemplacion in 1995. Again, it was an issue of a major issue. It led to great new legislation on overseas employment. It also caused a shift in government policy and directions, moving away from employment protection to greater protection of its nationals abroad, mainly because there was such an uproar on the vulnerabilities of Filipino migrant workers, especially women, and especially domestic workers. So 1995 was another such milestone. And I think 2020 will be another such goalpost. And I think we will be looking back at this period as a time when we possibly paused to revisit and to rethink the overseas employment directions and programs. And much of that will depend also on what this experience is going to be like and how we've managed this particular response. when we look back in 1974, overseas employment, the overseas employment program, it actually doubled the numbers of legal migrants overseas for employment simply by opening up channels for temporary employment, contractual employment, where people went on short-term contracts where there was almost no path to residency or citizenship. The idea was workers will return. And when you talk about a temporary program, it's really about temporary work, that they're expected to go out there and come back, and also a temporary program, which will be phased out after the country has caught up with enough opportunities at home. But we all know that that is perhaps too idealistic. What had happened instead was that, I think one of our colleagues did say, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary migration program. So the reality is, not just because there are no opportunities in the Philippines, but our workers are so, I mean, the upside to it is that our workers are preferred. And you have employers and labor markets which are desirous of Filipino workers. The only sad part about it is that there is much greater recognition of their abilities outside than they would be here inside the country. So the design was really for Filipinos to come back, to return and reintegrate. And therefore, it's a little bit of a sad thing as well that we have not really fully developed our return and reintegration programs. But I don't blame government for that, because if you look at, I've been just reviewing the National Migration Survey, which was done in 2018, which had a significant section on return migration. And when you look at the data there, their estimates really of return would say that there are about 3 million Filipinos who have returned from overseas work, who have come back. Now, majority of these individuals are not really aware of government programs, nor have they availed of government assistance. Now, that's a little, some of the development thinkers would say, hey, that's such a waste because they are coming back with new skills, new talents that could be, which could be given, bear on the country's development pathways, but that hasn't happened. But the good part about it is that they have come back and they really are independent on their own, with, I think, 70% saying they have sufficient financial resources to come back. And they don't really need help. And I think that is something we need to remember as well. Our workers are strong, resilient, and are able to come back and restart, in fact, a new job, a new business in the country. That said, the survey also did indicate that 51% experienced difficulty. Now, that's a large number. The experience of difficulty had to do with finding a job that matched his own skills or her own skills. There were also issues relating to pay, of course. Jobs were there, but they were not paying in the way that they were used to. And there were also issues of debt still, and there were still issues of family relations and reintegration back into the home communities. I don't know how many of you, I think all of us here on this panel would have gone out abroad and come back, and all of us know how difficult it is to actually get back and come back swinging and be absolutely active in the return. The next point I have is that we are familiar with crisis and repatriations. This is not new. Rex has talked about that. But our repatriations have been really more country specific, like Kuwait, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and financial crisis related. So you talk about 1997 and 2008, which are all financial crisis related. I'm not so sure how many did return because of health. So you're talking about SARS, the Ebola, H1N1. I'm sure there were, but I don't think we actually even monitored it. The numbers were not big enough, I guess, to monitor. But this is a crisis like no other. And that's why I think it is going to be causing major impact, because it is of global scale. It's affecting Filipinos all over the world. Although, as Undersecretary Sarah had said, it has really affected the Middle East, I think, disproportionately. We will be having most of our returns coming from that part of the world, which is also that part of the world where we have sent most of our workers. No? So I guess they're also related, two related phenomena. We are seeing heavy displacements in all skill categories, but we have been primarily hit as well in the seafaring, cruise ships in particular. So that has been hit. And when you're talking about cruise ships, we're also talking about entertainers. Don't think of ships as mainly marinos, you know. The large number in cruise ships are also our singers, our dancers, the waitresses, the waiters, who are not necessarily per se seafarers. This particular crisis has had tight restrictions on movement and mobility. And also and then here back in the Philippines, I think we are in a weaker position to be able to provide services to our migrant workers. I mean, that's just compared to all the other crises. We have, Rex has outlined all of our issues now. And for the first time that I have seen in all of our migration program and our migration history, I think it's the first time that I'm seeing a lot of stigma and discrimination against our migrant workers, primarily by also very simple, subtle things like families are not included in social amelioration packages. They're immediately excluded, or local governments not welcoming or embracing the return of our migrant workers and looking at them primarily as carriers of disease, which migrant workers already know. When they go to another country, sometimes they're suspected of being carriers of disease. So they come home and people are also treating them in the same way. When from our historical experience, am I talking too long now, Stella?
That's okay, go ahead, go ahead.
When we're talking about migrant behavior during times of crisis, we see about 2 or 3 types of behavior. Depends on the crisis. We see those who will immediately leave. If you're looking at the Kuwait crisis, for example, people had to go. They are in danger. There is fear of there's war. There's real displacement. Then you also see the loss of contracts, the loss of visas, residence stays. You see the irregulars really being hit very hard. So those who are going there without contract status are the first to go out, maybe deported. That's one group. And they're the ones who would actually really need immediate help to get out, because, you know, even the governments of those countries do not want them actually. And they're using sometimes crisis to make sure that they are returned back to home country. Then there are those who will wait it out. There are those who will say, look, things might get better. We will stay here. But in the process, what they will do is accept lower wages, have shorter working hours, cut days at work. I don't really know how long they will hold out, but they will hold out. They're going to wait and hope that things get better. I've studied the 2008 financial crisis. What we've seen there is that sometimes workers lose housing, lose food provisions, so they start cramming into certain places, and it becomes really problematic. And then there are also those who somehow are never affected. These are the, who are never really affected, are health workers who seem to be always wanted and desired, and even in times of crisis. And interestingly, and this is yet to be seen, are domestic workers, because they are in homes, they're in less difficult situations, but families like to keep them, especially they're more needed. But the problem with our women in particular, is that these are very often hidden positions, and some of them are going to be experiencing being compelled to work, forced to work, forced to overtime. There's a lot of coercion that might be possible in these types of occupations. Okay, so why will they go? Why will they stay? To answer your question, it really depends on, are they comfortable in the home society? Will they have local networks? Do they have income sources? Do they have community networks that they can rely on? And then they will also think in their head, if I go home, what is the cost of return and travel? The cost compared to the cost of relying on other people here. There will be the costs of, then they say, if I go home, I have expenses when I go home. And then the biggest fear they have is that if they want to keep the option of overseas employment open, it's hard to go back out. They'll have to go through the same recruitment processes, the same documentation. And some of them are saying, I don't have anything sure when I get back home. I have something sure here, so I'm gonna weigh it to see whether or not I should just stay here and wait it out. Rex had drawn already a very complex reintegration plan. I think I won't talk very much about that. I'm just going to talk about certain keywords that I think we should remember. I also have 4 tracks. I don't know why 4 is a favorite thing now, Rex, but the first track is safe, is really organized return, which is mainly what OWA is doing now, the FA and OWA are doing. Safe return, organized return. And I'd like to identify it, something I've read, it's not my words, it should be safe and dignified return. That we need to organize our returns in such a way that we try to bring the worker back to the family as the shield as soon as possible. There you also have to organize your humanitarian assistance, your protocols about health and safety, but also more important, when they leave the foreign country, and this is the burden on the foreign affairs people, that they have access to remedies. Some people don't also want to leave because they have gratuities which are coming at the end of the contract. They want to get their benefits, and if they leave now, they can't get their benefits. They can't get any closure from their projects. The next set is local employment and opportunity. Again, we have a lot of examples there. I can only reiterate that it has to be customized, especially designed to meet the profile of our workers. And as Rex and Noel maybe has said already, they are aging. We have more rehires than new hires. They are largely women. What are we going to do with those? So let's look at the profiles. Actually, POEA has good information on where the workers are from. If we don't know what the returnee's profile is, we can do some projections of what the workers went out were like. And therefore, more or less, that will be evenly distributed coming back. And then I'm going to submit 2 particular tracks, which we should, I think, start working on. And this is going to be more controversial. The first track that we should work on is the preserving and the retention of foreign employment. We have people who are staying on their foreign jobs. This is where I think Secretary Sarah, representation at the diplomatic levels is very important, is how do we keep the foreign job option open? First, mainly to protect the workers who will remain in countries of employment. And they need also their help to access remittances because banks are closed, access remedies, etc. And then important for our recruitment sector, what are we going to do about joint and solidarity liability? Because workers will stay, they will accept lower wages, they will accept shorter contracts, they may change employers. How do we handle that? Some protocol has to be established. The other track that I think we should also start working on and not be so concentrated on the humanitarian, which I think is important, but we should also start thinking about is really 51% of the studies, or in most of the studies, 51%, not just the Philippines, everywhere else, workers re-emigrate, they go back out. Now you need to provide, given the pandemic, certain safe zones, safe protocols. What are we going to do with the workers who are going back? There will be more than those, I think, who will decide to stay. Unfortunately, that is the situation. So again, stronger diplomatic representation. Look at the possibilities of abuse in this period, because there will be access to remedies, etc. I've been looking at what are the areas where there are safe zones. Can we now start? Remember, some areas have been, what do you call that? Shielded from the pandemic in a way, or they have been much more successful in stemming it. So our workers in Taiwan, in Korea, in Japan, are these markets opening? What is happening to ASEAN? Can we open up opportunities there? People won't like this because they want everybody to come home, and we all want everybody to come home. But based on historical experience, our workers continue to want to go out, and we need to respect those choices. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Thetis, for that comprehensive, first of all, overview of the Overseas Employment Program and the, what you call this, the
Crossroads.
Critical points in the Overseas Employment Program that have actually led the Philippines to rethink some aspects of its overseas employment program. And as you pointed out, this particular health crisis is really one that is likely to impact, the way our overseas employment program is going to, is going to develop in the next, in the near future. And this is particularly, this particular crisis really impacts a lot, and on the questions related to return and reintegration. And you have actually pointed out many, several very important points, that need to be addressed. Okay, before I ask my own questions, let me just go to the questions of the audience here. There are some questions that have been raised, and let me just ask some of them. I already asked about the database. There is a question here about, wait just a minute.
Mental.
Wait, I'm looking at the one here. There's a question here for Director Roel. Are there, the viewer asks, are there specific plans for returning seafarers, since world trade is projected to be lower, and since they have specialized skills that may be not all local employment sectors can accommodate? Okay, that's one question. Siguro, Director Roel, if you can address that, is that something you can give your thoughts on for seafarers?
For seafarers, with regard to the seafarers, we are talking with GEMG, or the Joint Money Group, including other cooperative seafarers for this, so that we'll be able to appreciate what are the skills and possible employment opportunities for our seafarers, because this is specific. They have specific trainings and training requirement. So tinitingnan ho natin dito at gagawa tayo ng programa para sa kanila kung nakikita ho natin na limited yung employment opportunities dito sa ating bansa.
And the other question here also, I think for Rex and Director Roel can also answer this. What mental health and psychosocial support are being provided in our reintegration program?
Okay.
Yes,
Well,
Roel.
yes, ma'am. Psychosocial, we're not expert on this, but we have tie up with Ugat Foundation, and admin has mentioned about the Consulta MD. These are partners, of course, the DSWD. These are partners who have been helping OWA and NRCO in providing psychosocial intervention to our returning OFWs. We have, it is worth it to note na marami hong affected returning OFWs, and they really need psychosocial intervention. And of course, this is also needed before we provide them with developmental as well as reintegration programs. We need to address first these concerns. So yun po, this morning there is a meeting at the OWA Central Office for those, we call them house parents, those specific staff employed to take care of our OFWs in the hotels, so that they need to know what are the qualifications that they need to possess, and of course a training from DSWD expert, so that they'll know what to do should specific psychosocial concerns arise from our overseas Filipinos.
Okay, thank you.
If I may add.
Yeah, Rex. Yeah.
By experience also, and through networks. Many civil society groups are providing such services overseas. Essential services, legal, paralegal, psychosocial, and other forms of assistance. So we can continue to use that, but also in the Philippines. And especially locally, we have what we call migrant resource centers. These were institutions that were created over the past 6 to 8 years as part of the migration and development initiatives. So what we can do is actually strengthen them. And having said that, as Director Roel was saying, the IRR of the social welfare attaché was just signed before COVID broke out. And DSWD is the lead implementer of that. They will become part of the team in the overseas offices to provide the psychosocial. Yeah, so there are a lot of those, but I think psychosocial in the context of COVID, yeah, many of the groups are rising up to that, including if they are victims of violence or abuse, then actually the PNP, they have Aling police hotlines, IACAT have hotlines, the PCW and Commission on Human Rights, they have hotlines for those also. Yeah, so there are a lot, but I think the point is, are migrants aware that they can actually access and call these hotlines? Thank you.
So the issue also of information dissemination so that migrants can access services that are available. Guru, a question I would like to direct to Yusek Sara. In relation to what Thetis mentioned about the importance of, ensuring safe and dignified return and also providing social protection for our overseas Filipino workers, what do you think can DFA do in order to, to address these issues? Yusek Sara.
I'm muting myself. Stella, just for you were talking about database. I think OWA might want, because all our posts, all DFA assisted repatriation, there's a whole of government approach now that we have a single database to be able to. Of course, the originator is the DFA. It's a very long matrix. I mean, it's as not only their names for where they are, and I think it's worth noting that especially from UAE, many of the returns are undocumented workers, because before COVID-19, we are having a big problem about trafficking in persons, particularly in the United Arab Emirates. That's why one of the reasons we have a memorandum of understanding with them in trying to curb trafficking, because a lot of our Filipinos are going to UAE as tourists but will try to find jobs there. So there's a different kind of profile, and that's why we have a deluge of requests for return, because these are the people who are, who went there and do not have enough social protection. But I think the dignified return, it's very important also to, I mean, Thetis mentioned something very, very important, that she said that a stronger diplomatic representation, and also we have to talk to our, to the countries of destination. If you would look at it, why most of the request for repatriation comes from people who do not have social protection, because they do not have anything to hold on to in the country of destination. So these are people who's either they have very bad employers, or there's already the whole system has collapsed and they could not be given that kind of protection. And so even the Middle East countries have been asking us to just get your people. I mean, bring back your people. But there's a certain Middle East country, particularly Bahrain, that had amnesty until December for our irregular and undocumented workers, so that they can regularize and become part of their flexi visa system, because the flexi visa system makes them not only they don't have an employer, they become freelance, but provides them for a return ticket to the Philippines, and at the same time it gives them what do you call this, health insurance. So whatever happens to them, they're taken care of. And in fact, the Philippines has supported around 1,000 or more flexi visas for our OFWs there to regularize. It's really part of the objective of the Global Compact for Migration: safe, orderly, and regular. as to dignified return, I think it's very important really to be able to, what we're trying to do is to be able to bring them home before they find themselves in such a situation that they already have psychological problems, because the COVID-19 has really impacted people differently, but some people cope better than others. But we realized that not all repatriates are created in the same way, or have not all Filipinos have the same level of resilience. I think those people who have been more resilient are the ones in the shelters, because they've been taken care of. Kasi hindi ka talaga magugutom pag nandun ka sa shelter ng Pilipinas, because the embassy will take care of you. But I think those people who are more in distress are those who are very far from our embassies. And just to show, for example, in Riyadh, which is I think bigger than the Philippines, it's very hard for us to reach people. But as of now, the only way that the Philippine government can do is, of course, make representations. Of course, the government of Germany is doing very, very well. They are augmenting the income of those people who are losing their jobs or even their corporation. That's why we do not have any, I mean, very, very minimal requests for repatriation. The ones from Italy have decided not to come home anymore. Kasi initially, ang dami-dami when the economy opened, but then it's still in the Middle East because there's a lockdown. That's the requests are very high. So what we can do is just really make sure to bring them home as fast as we could. Our problem is we have limitations in the airport as to the return of the Filipinos, because of the protocol that they have to be tested and they have to be quarantined. So we cannot bring home as many as we could. And extended quarantine also, if the system breaks down, is not also good for the mental health. As you can see, some of our repatriates will commit suicide also. But at this point, we try our best to be very responsive to the calls for repatriation. Because once they are with us, they'll already be taken care of. But unfortunately, especially in posts or in countries of origin where it's geographically difficult to reach our OFWs, then the problem begins. And you can see, for example, at least in UAE, we have 2 posts there, one in Dubai, one in Abu Dhabi. But the problem, for example, in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, because it's very, very big, it's very hard for people. And as you know, if you've heard, our polo is down in Riyadh because they got infected with COVID. So these are problems that we are also facing at the moment. But that's why we are, it's like we are racing for time, because we know the longer they stay there, the bigger the problem is and the bigger the crisis is. But as of now, it's a continuing struggle to bring more people home. And I think the best model that the government can do is what we're doing in Clark at the moment. In Clark, when you arrive on Saturday, you will be sent off. There's already a send-off on a Tuesday. So they arrive there, they get tested, the results come out in 48 hours, then they're brought home and they're taken care of. That's the gold standard, the BCDA standard. And that's what we're trying to do now. Here in Metro Manila, to make the return more convenient, because 14 days is not really necessary anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusek Sara. I think you partly answered the question that was raised by Professor Oye de Dios to all panelists. She says here, looks like the government did not anticipate that there will be delays in transporting returning migrants. The situation of stranded migrants is appalling, and no one seems to be helping them systematically. If we have thousands of migrants coming home in the next few months, who will be responsible for helping them when delays happen? So I guess you've given your answer to it, and unless anyone else in the panel would like to say anything in relation to this question.
I don't know who would be able to answer it. Maybe Secretary Sarah or Ruel.
Undersecretary Sarah.
Yeah,
Yes.
this
Um,
position that
yes.
airports can only accept 600 a day, is that a Philippine government imposition, or what is that? Is that real? I mean, is that 600 for Manila? Is it an NCR requirement?
Yes, ma'am. No, no, it's not a requirement. So basically, we can.
You can accept as many? I think there's a limit, isn't there?
Actually, I'll answer it. I'll answer it
It has
in
to do with airlines.
no. I
Uh,
have the best way I can, provided that it's not a actually. The thing is, the bottleneck has something to do with also the testing kits and the previous
mhm.
experience. Of course, there's always a tug of war between the DFA and the other government agencies, but it is an imposition of CAAP. However, this is only until this week. We have been promised for a higher number starting beginning next week, and at least this week there are more that are coming in. It's just that for every flight there has to be a CAAP approval. So the DFA is the one that's running, that's talking with the DOTR to be able to for the flights to come in. What's very important actually is that they'd be able to find hotels for the OFWs because we don't want them to stay very long in the airport, and at the same time there's enough testing kits to be able that we can test because it's going to be more difficult to bring them in. And I agree with Professor Oy that it's inhumane to just let them stay for 4 months. So, sobrang awang-awa talaga kami. So we are balancing the effort of because it's a whole of government approach. DFA brings home. If you're going to ask us, we'll bring them all home in one day. But then from the airport, after they arrive, you have to pass them on to another government agency. And they have systems also that cannot bog down, that cannot collapse. So that's why the Deputy Chief Implementer, Vince Dison, is trying to work out to open more airports, other international airports, to be able to accommodate the rest of the repatriates. So the gold standard is what's happening in BCDA. And we're hoping to open some other airports in the Visayas and Mindanao for the repatriation because we anticipate more to come home. It's just that we don't want people to come home without being tested, immediately tested, and immediately returning to their homes, not just in the hotels, because it's not cost effective also, and it has a very bad effect on the mental health of our repatriates.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here about data. One of our participants in the webinar asks, despite the calls to have an accurate numbers for monitoring Filipinos working abroad, how come the data of DOLE and OWA, or I guess but various government agencies monitoring our overseas Filipino workers in particular, do not seem to match? And I think this question of data is something that has been bugging, the overseas employment program from the start. Anyone can respond to that? There was supposed to be this SG, that under the law that you're supposed to integrate all of or rationalize all of the migration data, but I don't know what the status of that already is. Anybody? Maybe, is the PSA the one that is going to, to be on top of this? Because I think that's always been the question of data, that different agencies don't have the same numbers. So I guess, maybe if no one can answer that, I guess it raises again this one issue. Yes, go ahead, please.
There has been for quite a while an interagency committee working on data definitions. Part of the problem was people were defining phenomena in different ways. So first you need to have some standardization of what is even, for example, a returnee. Who's a returnee? Some definitions that are acceptable by everybody. So there was an effort to do that. I think I saw some of these matrices that they had to try to systematize that. I think we should also look at, I think more closely than a national migration survey, which was an effort to also show the extent of impact migration has had in national development. But, you know, sometimes your data follows an administrative procedure, right? So the data of migration will have a different, it serves a bureaucratic
Different purpose.
and sometimes because of those purposes, nagpapalit-palit. Depends on the mandate of the institution and the consistency. But I think what we really need, and maybe Undersecretary Ariola, we need to push in government more data champions, you know, who really push for it, because hindi pwedeng, you can't let the ball drop on this one. Kasi when times like this happen, talaga nagkakagulo, people are naghahanap ng good data.
I'll try to answer it the best way I could understand what's happening. When I'm not a career diplomat, I'm a political appointee. So when I arrived in DFA, there were attempts already in 2015 by the Department of Technology at the time, the OST, to be able to gather the data. But I think the problem is it comes from different government agencies. And they interpret it differently. Of course, POEA will give you the data of the documented workers, and that's their limitation. And the data that the posts all over the world have is what the country of destination will give them. You'd be amazed that in the Middle East, they even know how many undocumented they have. Because when they give us the data, I mean, the whole status, you'd be surprised. So when they talk to us, we know how many Filipinos are here. Are you undocumented? Are you like this? So they have that, and to a certain extent, since that's quite accurate. But the thing is, we are not sure how many are. Because since people keep on traveling and circumventing the process of migration, people are leaving as tourists or visit visas and eventually become migrant workers. We couldn't have it. But I'd like to think if and when there's going to be a single department on migration, then you will have a more accurate data because they could reconcile it. But of course now, since there are different people using different data, CFO has their own numbers. So then there's really a very large disparity, and we couldn't agree on a number. And of course, at the end of the day, it's also for funding, the issue of funding, because to be able to get data or to put everything together or as one system, you need a lot of funds for that. And considering now with the pandemic, all government agencies are really cost cutting and really putting all our possible savings together to be able to support the projects of the government now. Then it's something that's going to be very difficult to have now. But as for the ones who are coming home, there's a single sheet now being used by all government agencies to be able to get the data of those who are coming home.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this issue of return and reintegration is, we can really go on and on because there are many things that we have to take a look at. And if I go back to the title of this webinar, Babalik ka rin, hindi siya ganun kasimple. Merong babalik ngayon, pero karamihan, because of the current situation in the country, marami pa rin ang gustong babalik sa abroad. So, the question that was also raised by Thetis is, while we prepare for the reintegration of our workers locally, we also have to face the reality that many will still want to return. So the issue of employment retention, employment facilitation abroad, maybe including even reskilling and retooling of our workers so that they can still remain competitive abroad. Okay. Much as we would like to address some of there are quite a number of questions still raised. Some have been partially answered. We don't have the time, and we have to respect the time of everyone who's here, including our participants. So by way of closing, I'd like to ask for very brief final thoughts from each of our panelists, our resource speakers, starting with Undersecretary Ariola.
I think I just want to talk about the silver lining. I
Okay.
think because of COVID-19, although economies are really in recession as of the moment, this is also a reset for the Philippines to look at its migration policy. We lobbied very, very hard for the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And we cannot stop people from migrating. They will do that. But we have to assure that it's safe, orderly, and regular. And I think one thing that the COVID-19 stopped is the trafficking in persons because nobody can leave the country. So I mean, before COVID-19, all our SOS from our OFWs is about leaving their work, or they're being abused, or they're being trafficked. But now everyone wants just to come home. I think eventually it's very, very important for us to also strengthen our reintegration program. I think among the phases of migration, it has not been focused on for a few years now, or since the beginning, because we were really relying on our OFWs for remittances and everything. And but the reintegration program has to be given equal value as the pre-employment, pre-deployment, deployment, and of course return and reintegration. So while the DFA is very, very much overwhelmed because nobody anticipated this kind of, as Tetes mentioned a while ago, this has never happened in migration history. But then Filipinos are very resilient, and we will adapt. And I think for all those people in the migration sector, it's time for us to put our efforts together, put our heads together, and when things normalize, to be able to have a better migration policy for our people and for our nation. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
And final thoughts, Director Roel?
Yes, ma'am. Well, of course, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel webinar, and of course to present existing programs and services to our Filipino migrant workers. Well, OWA and RCO is up to the challenge. We will provide the needed programs and services to our migrant workers, but of course we need a lot of help, not just from the government, but of course from other stakeholders who are very much needed in this big challenge of return and reintegration. Mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Maraming salamat, Rex. Your thoughts, final thoughts?
Maraming salamat sa opportunity. I survived SARS in 2002 in Hong Kong. And when I returned in 2013 in Iloilo, I was training the LGUs and saying, I hate to see 10 years later when another pandemic hits us and then we don't have social protection and people will go home without even retirement benefits. It happened now again. So I hope the pandemic, as you, Sexara, is saying, gives us a reset in terms of thinking among migrants themselves. That hope is not always abroad, but also in hoping, we need to prepare. So preparation really, I think the backbone of work is really social protection. So if we are prepared for that, there'll be safety nets when we come back. And I think another hope is the digitization process makes people realize that a lot of things can actually be done even remotely. So hope communication, financial inclusion, and decision making. So we hope that the better future can really be built on the progress from now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Fetis?
I guess also to reiterate that we don't look at return migrants or our returnees as problems, that we look at them as, people who are ready to invest back in the country and with the right skills and can be placed, can be very productive citizens of our country here at home. So if we start looking at them that way, then we would welcome them back into our communities with open arms.
Thank you. On that note, I would like to thank our speakers for a very rich discussion this afternoon. Undersecretary Saralu Ariola, Director Roel Martin, Mr. Rex Varona and Ms. Tetis Abrera Mangahas for sharing their insights on our topic. We would also like to thank the officers and staff of the PMRN and the PSSC for making this webinar possible. We also would like to thank especially our viewers today, especially those who sent questions and sent in their comments for joining this timely and relevant discussion. For those of you who would like to view this webinar again, a recording will be made available shortly on PMRN's Facebook page. Okay, we urge you to tune in again to this page for announcements for future webinars and other PMRN activities. So before we close, I would like to request everyone to accomplish a brief evaluation form to help us further improve our webinar offerings. The link to the evaluation form is now being flashed on your screens and is posted in the comments section as well. Finally, without their help, I would like especially to thank the staff members behind the scenes, Mr. Miguel Caraan, Ms. Ena Tagiam, and Mr. Wilson Billones of the Philippine Social Science Council. Again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon and have a good day. Mabuhay tayong lahat.
Thank you.
Thank you.